And now I'd like to move on to Helen Haines, Independent Federal Member for the seat of Indi in North East Victoria. Helen was elected in the May 2019 federal election, becoming the first independent federal parliamentarian to succeed another in the same electorate since Federation in 1901. A nurse and midwife who has lived in North East Victoria for 30 years, Helen represents 140,000 Victorians in an electorate that stretches from Falls Creek and the high country in the north down to King Lake on Melbourne's outskirts in the south. Harnessing clean energy for Australia's future was a key part of Helen's 2019 election policy platform. Today, Helen will share her thoughts on how regional communities can achieve energy independence, economic growth, and increased resilience through community and council energy collaborations. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you to the Cities Power Partnership and the Climate Council for this invitation to join you today. I'm really excited to be meeting with you, and what I can see on the screen is now 332 participants, and thank you, Simon, for setting the scene so beautifully. We all know that there's a political debate in Australia about the future of our energy system, but if you follow the engineering, there's really only a question of pace, not direction. Australia's future will be renewable. Some of you will be familiar with the Integrated Systems Plan from the Australian Energy Market Operator. This blueprint maps out the lowest cost pathways to meet Australia's electricity needs over the coming decades. It's a technical analysis. It doesn't pay attention to ideology, and its conclusions are unequivocal. Right now, fossil fuels dominate Australia's electricity system, but over the next 20 years, most of our coal fleet will reach the end of its operational lifetime. They'll be retired, they will break down. As the price of renewables plummets, the real timeline will likely be much faster than we think. As the coal stations retire, we need to replace them with something, and renewables are the cheapest form of new power. That's why, in this technical analysis, by 2040, around 82% of our generation capacity will be renewables, mostly solar and wind. Last year, Australia installed 6.3 gigawatts of renewable energy, enough to power 3.1 million homes. Despite the pandemic, 2020 will see a similar result. In fact, the Integrated Systems Plan projects that our lowest cost transition will see the equivalent of 16,000 new wind turbines, 5 snowy hydro schemes worth of storage, 10 million more households will add rooftop solar. And this boom will happen in regional Australia. Our sun and wind will be mined right across the country, and regional Australia has the best renewable resources in the world. The Integrated Systems Plan maps out what it calls renewable energy zones. These zones are places with great renewable energy resources, strong grid connection, where new renewables will and should be built on the East Coast electricity market. Western Australia and the Northern Territory have similar regions and even greater potential. The massive investment in renewables will take place in these regions, and these investments could mean huge job opportunities. One recent analysis found that these regional renewable energy zones could create an additional 44,000 jobs by 2025. Out to 2040, that figure increases massively. But of course, the benefits of renewables aren't just jobs. We're building an enormous chain of connected renewable power stations in a sunbelt stretching right across the country. Those power stations will be selling electricity to the country and to the world. Who owns those stations, where the money goes, will have huge implications for regional development over the coming decades. And Australia's experience with renewable energy so far underscores that new development does not necessarily or inevitably benefit the local community. In the past, some developers frankly ignored local communities, and this is partly really why we saw the rise of the anti-wind lobby in the 2000s. So as we look ahead to the new phase, which will involve much greater numbers than in the past, we can't repeat those same mistakes. We have to involve community. So for regional Australia, There is a huge transition happening, a multi-decade wave of investment that's just starting to break, and we need to find a way to surf it, not just to let it pass us by. And I think community energy is a big part of that answer. Slide 3, please, David. Community energy, where everyday people develop, own, or benefit from renewable energy projects, is the definition that I give to this. Right now, all across Australia, there are over 100 community energy groups, organisations made up of everyday people who develop their own energy projects. There are community energy investment models where local people invest to wholly own a power station. For instance, in 2011, the town of Denmark, Western Australia, raised funds locally to develop a small wind farm. The Denmark Community Wind Farm is co-owned by the local community energy group and individuals in the town, and they receive returns on their investment, and they also access local generated power. In my community of Indi, my electorate of Indi, we have over 12 community energy groups. There are commercial co-investment models, and this is where a community becomes a co-investor with a commercial developer in a large-scale project. The classic example is the Sapphire wind farm in New England, New South Wales, which powers 115,000 homes. It's generated 150 jobs and was built with a $7.5 million co-investment raised from local people who are now receiving dividends alongside the commercial developer. And there are community council partnerships, so relevant for our audience today. This is where a local council becomes co-investor with a commercial energy developer to deliver an energy project with community involvement. The proposed 21 megawatt Marupna solar farm near Shepparton in Victoria. This will power 10,000 homes, and it's being built in partnership with the Greater Shepparton City Council, a local social enterprise called Golden Valley Community Energy Group, and the Acuo Energy, an international solar developer. Each of these models shows us a pathway forwards to maximise the benefits to renewables to regional communities. And the research shows us that when local people are directly involved in the development or ownership of renewable energy projects, it's a win-win. For the developer, those projects receive more local support, faster approvals, often higher returns. And for the community, these projects employ more locals, spend more money locally, and deliver greater lasting benefits. Community energy is a really helpful framing to think about not only accelerating our renewable transition, but making sure that it happens with and for regional Australians, not just to us. Over the last few months, I've been running a community co-design process to develop a national blueprint for community energy. We've never had a national plan that can capture the benefits of renewables for regional Australia. And I think that it's a critical piece of our economic recovery. Our economic recovery right now in this enduring COVID environment. And the results of our co-design process show that many people agree on some core elements. Overwhelmingly, people identify economic factors as the key benefits of community energy. Access to cheap power, new sources of income, local empowerment, and jobs are 4 of the top 5 drivers identified in our co-design process. From hundreds of conversations with people, not just in my electorate of Indi, but around Australia, I now believe that regional Australians are hungry for a practical plan of action on renewables that doesn't frame them as something we have to do to fulfil our obligations to a UN treaty, important as that is, but as something that we want to do to drive regional economic development. So the question for me becomes this: given the wave of investment in renewables that we're just starting to crest, given the fact that this will happen in regional Australia, and given the fact that we know that the more we're involved, the more we will benefit, what type of ideas should we be pushing for to help turn a wave of investment into a generation of shared prosperity? The next slide, please, David. So now is the time for bold ideas. And I want to outline 3 proposals that have been put forward in the community co-design process that I think have the potential. And the first is a 10-year investment scheme to support small-scale local energy projects. At the moment, there are ad hoc government grants available for groups to develop community energy projects. But what was really clear from our co-design process is that this type of investment is competitive, ad hoc, and people are incentivised not to share information. There's not enough money to go around, and this scares communities off looking for small-scale projects that could really help their communities. Why would you spend time on a grant application to put solar panels on the roof of your local school or hospital if you don't think you'll get it? Or if you don't have the expertise to pull together a proper application? And when you miss out, you never know when the next round will happen. So many people just give up. Totally Renewable Beechworth put forward a totally different way of stimulating this type of local activity. They said that if we had a 10-year investment scheme where community groups can access funding on regular timeframes, it gives people the certainty they need to actually invest time and effort improving their communities. It means you can spend a year or 2 developing a project like a community battery because you know that when it's ready, there will be funding available to get it off the ground. The second bold idea is underwriting investments in mid-scale projects. There's a gap in the market right now for mid-sized batteries and solar and wind farms. These projects, say between 1 to 10 megawatts, are just the right size for councils and communities to be developing. But many small investors have a low risk appetite, and so we don't see these projects happening. The Mitchell Community Energy Group called for government to underwrite these investments in locally owned projects, to de-risk them and unblock a new wave of investment. If an underwriting mechanism was applied to community-owned renewable stations, it could benefit thousands of regional towns and cities right across our country. Regional councils could build their own 5 or 10 megawatt solar farms and drastically reduce their power bills. The third bold idea is that every community should be able to co-invest in large-scale renewable projects. I mentioned earlier the Sapphire wind project in New South Wales that's been developed with part local ownership. So far, it's the only large-scale project of its kind to fit into this model in Australia. But most communities see massive international companies coming in and building projects with profits going to some distant location, far from their local community. Renewable Albury-Wodonga suggested we could have a requirement in legislation for large-scale renewable projects to offer local communities part ownership of new projects. In Denmark, since 2008, large-scale wind farms have been required to offer 20% of their ownership at cost price to locals. As a result, over half of the entire wind capacity of Denmark has a community ownership model. I'd love to see that in Australia. What if we had such a scheme here? Each year, Australians spend $12.8 billion on power bills. If 20% of that was bought from local owned renewable power stations, we're looking at multi-billion-dollar export industry for regional Australia. To wrap up, I want to leave you with 3 things that local government should be doing to capture benefits of renewable energy for their communities. First, expect more. Renewables should be built, and quickly, but they work best when they involve the local community and deliver lasting benefits. When developers come to town, expect them to be partners with you and with your community. Second, model change. Councils themselves can and should be driving this change. Look at examples that already exist where councils are co-investing or co-developing projects with developers and their communities. The benefits are massive, but to capture them, you need to move. And third, drive policy. Today, I've outlined some ideas that could drive a step change in how we build renewables in Australia. There are many more. This year has given us an opportunity like never before to shape the future that we want. So we need to get vocal, We need to get local because this is our chance. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Helen. Some great bold ideas there for us to consider. We've had some questions come in from our participants. I hope you've got a moment to answer a couple of them for us. The first question is that there seems to be a recent convergence of interest in and commitment to a renewables-led recovery. How can local government areas recently hit by drought, fire, flood and COVID all at once, in many cases, get help to take up current opportunities for recovery?
Thanks, David, and thanks to the questioner. And I think this speaks to the policy framework that I'm trying to pursue through government, and that is to open up opportunities for co-investment. I mentioned a broader fund that is a 10-year fund that can allow councils, local community groups, smaller players to develop their projects, and when they're ready, to have the opportunity to access funds. I'm very keen on the idea, as many of the participants in my co-design project, to establish community energy hubs across the nation where there's expertise, technical expertise and shared ideas, so that local government and community groups don't have to constantly reinvent the wheel. And I think the other thing to say is that second part of my bold idea, which is underwriting mid-scale projects, whereby there's the opportunity for councils to come in at that level, which is much more manageable and achievable. And finally, I think this idea of working with large developers and to give that share opportunity, which councils could join in and everyday people can join in. So I guess they're my ideas and certainly supported by over 100 submissions to my co-design process.
Fantastic. Obviously, you know, your electorate has, you're focusing largely on regional opportunities, but we've had a question come in here about how do we involve and empower communities to take up renewable options, particularly within urbanised areas with highly diverse populations where environmental and community energy literacy could be an issue. Do you have any thoughts on how this model could maybe be applied in a more urban situation?
Yeah, so David, absolutely, I've focused on rural and regional Australia, and obviously I would as a rural and regional Member of Parliament, but I think there's already some great examples in urban Australia, and many of those councils, and I'm thinking of some local councils in Melbourne who've partnered very much with areas of needs, for example, in social housing. So I think there's real opportunities there to look at bulk buys, for example, to find opportunities to engage local communities in a renewable future where they're currently shut out. And so I guess I would point some of our urban councillors to those examples, and you've spoke to them yourself in your introduction, David, and Simon did too. We're seeing the City of Melbourne doing extraordinary things, the City of Sydney the same. But I think when you look at individual councils, I would look to some of our social needs as a first step.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned Sydney and Melbourne, and I know, you know, Sydney with its renewable energy deals has partnered with wind farms out in the region and councils out in the region. Do you see more opportunity for that kind of collaboration between rural and regional councils and metropolitan areas?
I sincerely hope so. I think that's something that we could and should be doing far more. As I highlighted in my talk, the resources are out in the region, so that's where the sun and the wind truly is. So an opportunity for a metropolitan council to partner with a rural council who may have a different set of resources, financial resources, I think is again another bold idea, and would build partnerships well beyond our energy. Actually, I think it would build some extraordinary new projects that we haven't even thought about yet.
Well, thank you, Helen. That's all we've got time for this morning. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you for those bold ideas that you've shared with us. I'm sure they'll be of great interest to many of our participants. Thank you.